1983, Jacques Demy released A Slightly Pregnant Man, his first film explicitly dealing with a cross-gendered character. Some 4 years later, Demy was approached by Japanese producer Matachiro Yamamoto to direct a film based on the popular shoujo manga or manga for girls by Ryoko Ikeda entitled The Rose of Versailles, which draws from folklore about maiden warriors. By 1974, episodes of the manga had already been staged by the Takarazuka Review, an all-women Japanese theater troupe, and performances of The Rose of Versailles ran as recently as 2006. The manga's popularity also led to an anime that aired on Japanese television in 1979. Released in Japan a year before the film's French premiere, Lady Oscar was to ride the tide of Ikeda's best-selling manga. The manga and film draw from tales about maiden warriors, whereby a girl must don the clothes of a soldier in order to maintain her father's honor and legacy and protect King and Kingdom. Oscar François de Charget is born a girl, but her father raises her as a boy since birth with the intention that she take his place as head of the King's Royal Guard. What makes The Rose of Versailles and Lady Oscar particularly interesting is that the action takes place during the French Revolution, and Oscar proves to be less obedient to father and fatherland than legendary predecessors Mulan and Mademoiselle. Just as the heroine's gender identity is in flux throughout the story, so is a society that upholds traditional forms of gender, sexual, and social order. Despite the fact that the film was a commission, the manga upon which it was based dealt with issues that were common currency in Demy's cinema, most notably challenges to bourgeois and heteronormative conceptions of class, gender, and sexuality. By situating The Rose of Versailles and Lady Oscar within the tradition of the maiden warrior, it becomes evident that the manga and film represent queer rewritings of such tales. In traditional versions of the maiden warrior, the heroine lives as a girl, then transforms momentarily into a soldier, only to return to the unambiguous status of female. Lady Oscar, however, always inhabits an ambiguous gender position. She embraces and internalizes the masculine identity of a soldier, which she cannot simply shed at the end of the story. Although cross-dressing and classical examples of the maiden warrior certainly can elicit queer readings of the tales, Ikeda and Demy actively queer the classical paradigm by maintaining the gender ambiguity of the heroine from beginning to end, and by exploring alternatives to heteronormative forms of sexuality. Both the manga and film stage a crisis of class and gender as well as heteronormativity, which are all in play and come to a head in the French Revolution, marking the end of an old regime of class, gender, and sexuality. The basic narrative of the classical maiden warrior tale type can be characterized as follows. The youngest daughter of a noble household with no sons joins the king's army in order to uphold family honor. Passing as male, the heroine becomes a successful knight and protects the kingdom. The king may or may not fall in love with her, and the tale ends with the daughter returning to her initial gender after having defended father and fatherland. In such tales, the maiden knight maintains a tenuous relationship to patriarchal power, simultaneously transgressing and reaffirming paternal authority by upholding family and national honor. The same goes for her relation to gender and sexuality. The transgression is limited to the period during which the heroine reestablishes national and familial order, at the end of which she will be initiated into womanhood through marriage or return to domestic work. In each case, the heroine eventually must renounce her masculinity. Like a carnivalesque festival, these narratives momentarily open up possibilities of gender and sexuality, only to reestablish boundaries by the end of the tale. The ways in which the maiden warrior gets shaped in the shoujo manga tradition, however, increasingly queers her character. This is particularly true for Ikeda's Rose of Versailles, the source for Demy's Lady Oscar. Critics agree that Osamu Tezuka's The Princess Knight was the founding text for shoujo manga. Tezuka's manga conforms in many respects to the type of maiden warrior tales discussed above. Sapphire, who has both a male and female heart, but is supposed to be a girl, is raised as a boy in order to inherit her father's throne, which can only be passed down through the male heir. Like these other tales, Sapphire must identify as male for the sake of family honor as well as for the kingdom, which risks falling into the corrupt hands of Duke Durlman. Along with fairy tale motifs, an important influence in the creation of The Princess Knight is the Takarazuka Review, an all-woman theater troupe created in 1913 in the city of Takarazuka, where Tezuka grew up. The earliest Takarazuka performances include fairy tale operettas such as Hansel and Gretel and Jack and the Beanstalk. From the 1920s onward, the Takarazuka Review borrowed from European opera and Shakespeare, moving into a fare of American musicals in the 60s and 70s. Actresses are trained to play either male or female roles, and as critics have noted, quote, the otoko-yaku, or male impersonators in particular, attract legions of female fans and have often been portrayed in the context of an ideal male image. Much like the maiden warrior tradition, Takarazuka theater necessarily shakes the foundations of conceptions of gender and sexuality. And it's much more complex than the longer version of this, but I'll stop there. While the characters in The Princess Knight visually appear prepubescent, those from Ryoko Ikeda's Lady Oscar are more physically mature. As Deborah Shimonis noted, at the time the Rose of Versailles appeared, quote, shoujo manga was just beginning to shift its demographic from elementary school children to high school students. This shift corresponded with the emergence of a new group of female shoujo manga writers referred to as the Year 24 group, all of whom were influenced by Tezuka's work. The group, quote, dealt openly with politics, sexuality, and with the psychological development and interiority of the characters. The trend was launched by Keiko Takemiya's In the Dark Room, published in 1970, which contains the first male-on-male kiss in shoujo manga. Works that followed in its wake included Akida's The Rose of Versailles, Moto Hajio's The Heart of Thomas, a love story revolving around 20th century German schoolmates, and Yasuko Oeko, I cannot say her last name, from Eroica with Love, which concerns English Earl and art thief Dorian, modeled on Dorian Gray and Robert Plant, who becomes interested in German NATO officer class. This trend in shoujo manga came to be known as boys love manga, also referred to as beautiful boys. Same-sex romance between beautiful boys became a staple in shoujo manga, whose audience was predominantly female. The Rose of Versailles represents a fascinating example of shoujo manga in that it draws from Tezuka's premise about a girl being raised as a boy out of need for a male heir. It visually conforms to and feeds into the beautiful boys tradition, although the story concerns the cross-dressed Oscar and her affection for Fersen and Andre. And just as it draws, as do all shoujo manga from the Takarazuka Review, it also significantly feeds back into it. Robertson notes that, quote, the Rose of Versailles is regarded by the review and fans alike as the most memorable and successful post-war review to date. Having already attained success in manga in Takarazuka form, no wonder producer Yamamoto wanted to turn the Rose of Versailles into a film. Lady Oscar presents both continuities and discontinuities with warrior maiden tales. As in the cases discussed above, the head of household is in need of a male heir to carry on the family's military and political duties to the monarchy. Upon realizing his wife has given birth to their sixth daughter, General de Jacques decides he will raise her as a boy. In the earlier maiden warrior tales, the heroine Indre conceals her female identity at all times. In the case of Oscar, however, her female identity is never a secret. At home, as well as at court, members of the French aristocracy are aware that Oscar is a woman in men's clothing. They appear to accept to some degree her gender ambiguity. At the same time, Oscar is more thoroughly masculine than her predecessors, or at least masculinity represents an integral and significant part of her identity. Raised as a boy in boys' clothes with their nursemaid's grandson, Andre, Oscar continues to don male garb as she enters the service of Marie Antoinette. Unlike Sapphire, who devotes several hours a day to her feminine side, which takes the form of wearing a dress, Oscar simply does not know what to do with one. Everyone knows Oscar is sexed as female, and precisely because her masculinity is essential to her being, Oscar proves to be a more complex and ambiguously gendered character than earlier versions of the maiden warrior. Akita also opens up the limit of sexuality in her depiction of Oscar. In maiden warrior tales, female characters generally only fall in love with the heroine when they believe she is a he. In the case of Lady Oscar, however, women are attracted to her all the while realizing he is sexed as she. Earlier in Oscar's life at court, Akita produces a scene in which several young ladies Google him. There is Oscar Francois. Oh, he's so handsome. It's Oscar. What coldness, he never addresses us. If he really was a man, I would do everything to be his wife. Well, I prefer Andre. Oscar looks over at them. Oh my God, he's looking this way. But you said you preferred Andre. I'm going to dream about him all night. Aware that Oscar is a woman, these ladies nevertheless gaze and fantasize about him, and they blush when Oscar looks their way. Such scenes recur throughout the manga in which female characters develop schoolgirl crushes on Oscar and can only dream of marrying him or her. In the manga, Andre is the only male protagonist who fully accepts Oscar's gender ambiguity. Andre loves Oscar as a masculine woman. This is emphasized when Oscar prepares for the first ball. Aware that Oscar wears a dress for person, Andre suggests that it is when Oscar tries to pass as a feminine woman that she is truly in drag. While Shimon studied the Rose of Versailles does an excellent job of situating the manga within the larger historical and cultural context of shoujo manga, her analysis of Jack Demi's filmic adaptation is limited precisely because she does not situate it within Demi's oeuvre. She states, quote, "In the film, Andre, Barry Stokes, is the strongest partner, and their conflict is not about Oscar's need for independence or her fear of losing herself in a relationship, but about their class differences. Andre mockingly and smugly dictates Oscar's political awakening, but they never become social or romantic equals," end of quote. Drawing from Shimon's analysis, one could argue that Demi's film takes away from the ways in which Akita's manga empowers the ambiguously gendered Oscar. His film could be read as reinstating a patriarchal order precisely by having Andre mediate Oscar's transformation and by depicting Oscar as the weaker partner in the couple. However, the reading of the film proves more complex when we situate it within Demi's cinema. It becomes clear that his adaptation of the manga is shaped by what Philippe Codon has identified as a coming-out narrative that recurs in Demi's films. Akita's Oscar has much more self-knowledge than Demi's heroine, who is initially in denial about class and sexual issues. In the manga, Oscar seeks out answers to the questions she is already asking herself. In the film, however, it is Andre who asks the questions Oscar fails to, serving as her guide in her coming out. The relationship between Oscar and Andre can be read as queer in several respects. First, the two are suckling siblings raised as brother and sister. As such, their relationship can be construed as incestuous, which serves as a figure in Demi's film for queer forms of love, and I talk about this in an earlier chapter. Second, Oscar's gender ambiguity, the fact that in most respects she feels like a man, she walks, talks, fights, and thinks like a man, sets her relationship with Andre outside the norms of heteronormativity. Finally, we can read into the incongruity of their class-crossing relationship, another figure for transgressive sexuality. However, Oscar has a great difficulty in accepting her feelings for Andre. Like Akita, Demi stages two ball scenes, the first of which establishes Oscar's inability to acquire Fersen's love. In Demi, Fersen does not state that it is because of her ambiguous gender identity that he rejects Oscar, but rather it is because he's hopelessly in love with Marie Antoinette. In the next scene in which Oscar appears, she's left the ball and walks by a fountain. Andre appears and forcibly embraces her, and this is the dialogue that ensues. "I love you, Oscar. You have no right." "Oh, you're wrong. I do have the right. I've loved you for my entire life. I have the right to keep on loving you. I don't pity myself because that love isn't returned. I pity you for being unable to return it. You dared all this because you knew Fersen loved another. Shut up. And we'll both pretend none of this ever happened. We'll be like those life-size puppets in the Queen's Hamlet. I'll be the invisible stable boy, and you'll be the brave toy soldier." The dialogue asks us to read Oscar's attraction to Fersen in terms of the displacement of a reflection for a taboo object, Andre, onto a more socially acceptable one, being Fersen. Oscar, doomed to failure her attempt to conform to social norms from the start by trying to attract Fersen, who's noble, whom she knew loved another. Andre suggests here that he knows Oscar loves him and that she's afraid to act upon this love precisely because it's taboo, but only taboo within the arbitrary social norms of pre-revolutionary France. The idea that Oscar is separated from Andre by arbitrary conventions is emphasized in the scene in which Oscar seeks out Andre in the stables in Versailles. She tells Andre that she misses him, but insists on their class difference, stating that they are, quote, separated by the laws I've accepted as the right laws. Whereas Oscar dwells on the way things are, Andre reflects on the way things could be, declaring, quote, a man can love whomever he wants in America. Invoking utopic possibilities, Andre tries to point out the arbitrariness of the laws that separate them and bring about unnecessary suffering. We can obviously read into this dialogue as pertaining to class and the ways in which the American Revolution inspired the French Revolution. Expressing the freedoms that were gained in the American Revolution in terms of being able to love whomever one desires, however, begs the reading of the scene in terms of the vindication of a queer sexuality. Through this lens, Andre's words could be understood as alluding to another, more recent American Revolution that similarly influenced France, the Stonewall Riots of 1969, which gave impetus to gay activists in France. Although an accident, as Bertoni puts it in his film career, Lady Oscar effectively serves as another vehicle for Denis to explore his preoccupation with revolutionizing gender and sexuality, of creating a world in which people are not condemned for loving each other based on arbitrary social conventions. Regarding the violent response from the French people to his own transgressive relationship with Marie Antoinette, a married woman, Denis Fersen pensively says to Oscar, strange, isn't it, that a simple love between two people can be despised as hatred and war. Fersen's lament about the hatred shown to people just for being in love anticipates Andre's utopic depiction of America as a place where one has the right to love whomever one desires. Such moments in the film reveal that Lady Oscar is as much about liberation with respect to class as it is about liberation with respect to sexuality. Denis himself was slowly becoming more daring as a director with respect to sexuality. In Lady Oscar, Denis films his first same-sex kiss, which occurs, as in the manga, during the second ball scene. Denis' 1982 film Parking, based on the story of Orpheus and influenced by Jean Cocteau's film Orphée, also includes a same-sex kiss, this time between Orpheus and a male friend. In his piece on sexuality and Denis, Raphael Lefebvre notes the increased use of nudity in his films and describes Denis' final film, 3 Seats for the 26th, in terms of, quote, calm audacity, absence of guilt and moral judgment. Denis tops off his career with a shaky film, but with a stunning vision of love and taboos. Given this rather daring representation, relatively speaking, of queer sexuality, Lady Oscar marks a significant moment in Denis' own evolution as a director. As such, we might look at Oscar as a figure for Denis himself, who comes out as a queer director or director of queerness through the film. Thank you. Japanese culture, but there is a history starting in the early 20th century of girls' magazines, and actually homoerotic relations between girls was not socially sanctioned. I mean, there was this idea that if girls are having sex with each other, that's fine, as long as they're not having sex with men and getting pregnant. So they're considered chaste until they get married. So there was Deborah Shamoon talks about this culture, and then so you have these girls' magazines. Tezuka writes his Sapphire, which sort of becomes iconic, and then it's really interesting because the group 24, Ryoko Aikido's work and that whole group, they were actually influenced by gay magazines. But it seems that because they were published within the context of these girls' magazines, it was already public there for these mangas. So it's, yeah, I wish someone from Japanese studies was here to talk more about that, but it is an interesting culture on the side of Japan, and then the fact that Sapphire was influenced by the Takarazuka theater, which is also a whole interesting phenomenon, and there's whole debates about, you know, is this about lesbianism, is this about girls projecting, heterosexual girls projecting onto these idealized men who are better than real men, a sort of heterosexual relationship? Is it an exploration? I mean, there's all kinds of debates around that. I don't know if that answered your question, but that goes a little bit, it's really complicated, actually, that history. Janet, did you have a question?
Well, I had a question on the other side of it. I don't really know very much about Demi's work.
Right.
You already showed a comparison in terms of the same-sex kiss, but how would you place this work in his oeuvre? You mentioned it was a little sideline.
Well, you know, I think, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, and I guess my use of queer is very sort of conscious here, too, because Denis was married. Denis never came out. I mean, I think people know he was gay, bisexual. He died of AIDS, and so his own sexual identity is very complicated. But he is, like, even though his earlier films are, you have this sort of, like, I'm thinking of the Demoiselles de Rochefort. There's a male character called Monsieur Dame, Mr. Lady, and this woman doesn't want to marry him because, well, how can I marry a man named Monsieur Dame? And so, you know, she can't, and there's sort of a queer relationship there. I mean, he's not a masculine man, but it only happens at the level of his name. And so I think what's interesting about Lady Oscar, I mean, I didn't talk at all about class, which is a really important aspect of this film as well, because he was working on a film about class. I won't talk about that now, but I think this is from this film onward, I think what we see generally is that he is taking more chances when it comes to sexuality, and he felt that France was very conservative. I mean, he was giving, you know, we cannot do in France what Paul Morrissey and Warhol have done in the United States. So he was definitely looking towards the United States as a model for kind of a much more open conception of the body of sexuality in cinema. But he didn't feel, I don't think he felt he could do that in France.
One more question?
Yeah, I wonder, excuse me, if you could, this isn't about like, the meat of your presentation. Maybe I got here late, and I don't know if anyone discussed this earlier in the symposium, but I wonder if you could talk about the evolution of the word queer. For example, just very, not that long ago, a fellow person in academia asked me if another person in academia was queer, and it really it kind of shocked me because it's not that long ago that the word queer was pejorative. And, you know, like at least in academia, there's been this expression of queer studies for a while.
Right.
And clearly sort of gay, at least part of the gay community has sort of made the word its own, and therefore, at least within the gay community, made it acceptable. And now within academia it is, but if I hear somebody refer to someone else as queer, to me it still sounds insulting. I wonder if you could just sort of talk about this a little bit.
Oh, God. Where would I start? I mean, I think there's lots of different ways. I mean, I think, let me talk about my specific project, because, I mean, you could say that, I mean, I think queer has become sort of a nebulous term that, you know, as Judith mentioned in her keynote, you know, what is it? It's hard to pin down. I think what it might do for me working with Denis is that, is he gay? Is he a gay director? Is he a bisexual director? So in a way, I mean, I'm using queer theory, I'm drawing from that, but I think it also helps me kind of talk about a director who didn't identify as in any one category. So, I mean, I think, I don't know, did that answer your question? I mean, we can talk about it more. I'm
Yes, that perhaps during the reception or after the session is over.
Yeah.
Other further discussion.